Welcome, friend. I know you watch this video to fall asleep, so before that, make sure to leave a like and share this video. Also, where are you from, and what time is it where you are from? Welcome to a journey unlike any other. Tonight we'll explore 25 extraordinary Buddhist stories that have been carefully chosen not just to help you drift into peaceful sleep, but to plant seeds of wisdom that will bloom in your dreams and carry you through tomorrow with greater clarity and calm. These aren't just bedtime tales. They're sacred transmissions from awakened minds who discovered profound truths about the nature of existence, suffering, and the path to liberation. Each story we'll explore tonight carries within it a key that can unlock doors in your consciousness you may not even know exist. Some will gently dissolve the knots of anxiety that have been tightening throughout your day. Others will reveal why certain patterns keep repeating in your life. And a few will show you glimpses of a peace so deep and natural that you'll wonder why you ever thought happiness was something you had to chase. As we move through these timeless narratives, you may notice something beautiful beginning to happen. The endless chatter of your mind will start to quiet. The weight you've been carrying on your shoulders will begin to melt away. Your breathing will naturally deepen and slow. This isn't magic. It's the natural response of your nervous system when it finally feels safe enough to let go. These stories have traveled through centuries, passed down from teacher to student in monasteries hidden among misty mountains, whispered in meditation halls by flickering candlelight, and shared in moments of profound stillness when the veil between ordinary consciousness and deeper truth grows thin. Tonight, they find their way to you, exactly when you need them most. So let yourself settle completely into this moment. Release the day behind you. There's nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to accomplish. Your only task now is to receive these ancient gifts of wisdom and allow them to work their gentle transformation within you. Let us begin with our first story, a tale about recognition and the masks we wear in search of acceptance. The village elder and the mountain sage. In a valley where morning mist clung to terraced rice fields like prayers made visible, there lived a village elder named Kenji, who was respected by all who knew him. His wisdom in settling disputes was legendary. His counsel was sought by families from neighboring villages. His presence at community gatherings brought a sense of order and peace that everyone could feel. Yet despite this outward success, Kenji carried a secret burden. Deep within his heart lived a persistent question that had haunted him for decades. He wondered whether his wisdom was genuine or merely the performance of wisdom. When people bowed to him with reverence, he felt like an imposter wearing robes that belonged to someone else. Word reached the valley of a mountain sage whose understanding was said to transcend all conventional knowledge. Unlike the learned monks in their grand temples, this teacher lived in complete simplicity, owning nothing but the clothes on his back and a small clay cup for water. Pilgrims would climb for days through dangerous passes just to sit in his presence for a few moments. Kenji decided he must make this journey. Perhaps this mountain sage could see through his pretenses and offer the authentic wisdom he felt he lacked. After weeks of preparation, he set out before dawn on a path that wound upward through forests of ancient cedar and pine. The climb was treacherous. Several times Kenji nearly turned back, his aging body protesting each steep ascent. But something deeper than determination pulled him forward. As he climbed higher, the air grew thinner, and with it, the weight of his reputation seemed to lighten. No one up here knew him as the respected village elder. He was simply an old man with aching feet and a searching heart. On the third day, as sunset painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Kenji reached a small plateau where smoke rose from a simple fire. Beside the flames sat a figure so ordinary that Kenji almost walked past without stopping. The man appeared to be just another traveler, perhaps a woodcutter or merchant who had made camp for the night. "Excuse me," Kenji called out, approaching with careful steps. "I'm looking for a great teacher who lives somewhere on this mountain. Have you seen him in your travels?" The man by the fire looked up with eyes that held depths Kenji had never encountered. They seemed to reflect not just the firelight, but something far more ancient and luminous. When he spoke, his voice carried the gentleness of wind through leaves. "I am that teacher," he said simply. "But more importantly, who are you?" Kenji felt his prepared introduction dissolve on his tongue. All the titles and accomplishments he had planned to share suddenly felt hollow as empty shells. Under this man's gaze, he could only speak the truth that lived beneath his carefully constructed identity. "I am someone who has spent his whole life pretending to be wise," Kenji said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am someone who fears that everything people respect about me is just an elaborate performance. I am someone who has climbed this mountain hoping to find real wisdom because I'm no longer sure I possess any." The sage smiled with such warmth that Kenji felt something tight in his chest begin to unravel. "Finally," the teacher said, "someone tells me the truth. Do you know what your problem has been all these years in the valley below?" Kenji shook his head, not trusting his voice. "You have been trying to be wise instead of simply being yourself. True wisdom isn't something you acquire or perform. It's what emerges naturally when you stop pretending to be anything other than exactly what you are in this moment." The sage gestured for Kenji to sit beside the fire. As the old elder settled onto the ground, he felt a strange lightness, as if he had just set down a pack he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten its weight. "The wisdom your villagers recognize in you," the teacher continued, "doesn't come from your knowledge or your experience, though these have their place. It comes from the moments when you forget to be the village elder and simply respond from your heart. It comes from the times when you stop trying to be wise and allow wisdom to flow through you." As the night deepened around them, Kenji began to understand. His years of self-doubt hadn't been a flaw in his character, but a doorway to humility. His fear of being an imposter had kept him humble, open, receptive to truth, rather than convinced of his own righteousness. "But how do I know when I'm being authentic versus when I'm performing?" Kenji asked. The sage picked up a small stone from beside the fire and held it in his palm. "Does this stone try to be a stone? Does it worry about whether it's stone enough? Does it compare itself to other stones, or fear that someone might discover it's not a real stone?" Kenji smiled despite himself. "Of course not. It simply is what it is." "Exactly. And when you stop trying to be wise and simply be yourself, your natural wisdom flows as effortlessly as water finding its way down a mountainside. The villagers recognize this authenticity even when you don't. What you call pretending, they experience as presence." They sat in comfortable silence, watching sparks rise into the star-filled darkness. Kenji felt something shifting in his understanding, like tumblers falling into place in a lock he had been trying to open for decades. "Will you teach me how to stop pretending?" he asked finally. The sage laughed, a sound like water over stones. "I just did. The teaching is complete. You are already exactly who you need to be. The only practice required is remembering this truth when you forget it." When morning came, Kenji began his descent back to the valley. But something fundamental had changed in those few hours by the fire. He no longer carried the weight of trying to live up to some image of who he should be. Instead, he walked with the lightness of someone who had remembered their original face. Back in the village, people noticed the change immediately, though they couldn't quite name what was different. Kenji's counsel seemed to flow from an even deeper well of understanding. His presence brought a quality of peace that was both familiar and somehow more profound than before. What they were witnessing was not the performance of wisdom, but wisdom itself, expressing naturally through a human being who had finally stopped trying to be wise and allowed himself simply to be. The merchant's impossible burden. Our second story takes us to the bustling trade routes of ancient India, where caravans carrying silk and spices wound their way across vast deserts under star-filled skies. Among these merchants was a man named Arjun, whose success had become his prison. His caravans were the largest, his goods the finest. His reputation for reliable delivery unmatched across 3 kingdoms. Yet with each successful venture, the weight of maintaining his empire grew heavier. Arjun owned 17 camels, employed 43 men, and carried responsibility for feeding their families. Every decision rippled outward, affecting dozens of lives. The constant pressure of managing routes, negotiating prices, and avoiding bandits had transformed what was once his passion into a source of endless anxiety. One evening, as his caravan made camp near a small oasis, Arjun found himself unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. The familiar knot in his stomach had tightened to the point where even breathing felt labored. He rose from his bedroll and walked to the edge of the camp, where the desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. There, sitting beside a small fire, was an old monk whose simple robes marked him as a wandering teacher. The monk's face held such serene composure that Arjun felt drawn to approach, though he rarely sought the company of religious men. "Master," Arjun said, settling beside the fire without invitation, "forgive my intrusion. I am a merchant, not given to spiritual matters, but I find myself in need of counsel. The weight of my responsibilities has grown so heavy that I fear it will crush me. Yet I cannot abandon those who depend on me. How does one carry such a burden without being destroyed by it?" The monk studied Arjun's face in the firelight, seeing not just the outer success, but the inner turmoil that had carved lines around his eyes. "Tell me," the monk said quietly, "when you load your camels for a journey, how much weight does each animal carry?" "Each camel can carry about 400 pounds, Arjun replied, puzzled by the seemingly unrelated question. "Any more and they become injured. Any less and the journey becomes unprofitable." "And what happens if you try to load one camel with the weight meant for all 17? Understanding began to dawn in Arjun's eyes. The animal would collapse immediately. It would die from the burden. The monk nodded slowly. "Yet this is exactly what you have been doing with your own life. You are trying to carry not just your own portion of responsibility, but the weight that belongs to your employees, their families, your customers, even the success of ventures that have not yet begun." The merchant felt something shift in his chest as these words settled into his awareness. "But surely a leader must think of all these things," Arjun asked, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "A leader must think, yes," the monk agreed, "but thinking and carrying are different actions entirely. When you plan for your employees' welfare, you think with wisdom. When you lie awake at night feeling responsible for their children's hunger, you carry weight that was never yours to bear. The monk reached into the sand beside him and withdrew a handful of grains, letting them slip slowly through his fingers back to the earth. Each grain of sand supports only itself, he said. Yet together, they form the foundation that holds up this entire oasis. Your employees are not children who cannot support themselves. They are capable adults who have chosen to work with you because it serves their own purposes. When you treat them as helpless dependents, you rob them of their dignity and yourself of peace. Arjun watched the last grains fall from the monk's palm, feeling something he had forgotten existed beginning to stir within him. It was a sensation he dimly remembered from his early days as a merchant, before success had transformed joy into obligation. How does one distinguish between necessary responsibility and unnecessary burden? He asked. The monk smiled, recognizing the genuine seeking in the merchant's question. Ask yourself this: does this concern require action from me today? If yes, take that action fully and completely. If no, why are you carrying it? But what about planning for future difficulties? Surely that is wise stewardship. Planning is action. Worrying is burden. When you sit down with your maps and calculate the safest routes, you are taking action. When you lie in your tent imagining all the disasters that might befall your caravan, you are carrying tomorrow's problems today. Tomorrow's problems belong to tomorrow's wisdom. They sat in comfortable silence as this truth settled into Arjun's understanding, like water soaking into parched earth. Around them, the desert stretched in all directions, vast and seemingly empty, yet somehow perfectly balanced in its austere completeness. I have been trying to control outcomes that are beyond my influence, Arjun said finally, more to himself than to the monk. And in doing so, you have lost your ability to influence the outcomes that are within your reach. A merchant who is consumed by anxiety about bandit attacks may miss the signs of an actual bandit approach. A leader who is paralyzed by fear of making wrong decisions often makes no decisions at all. The monk reached for a small clay cup beside the fire and poured water from a leather pouch, offering it to Arjun. The merchant accepted it gratefully, surprised by how thirsty he had become. "Drink," the monk said. "But notice that the cup does not worry about the water it will hold tomorrow, or grieve for the water it held yesterday. It simply contains what is present now, fully and completely." As Arjun drank, he became aware of sensations he had not noticed in months. The coolness of the water on his tongue, the gentle warmth from the fire on his face, the vast silence of the desert broken only by the soft breathing of sleeping camels in the distance. "This moment," he said wonderingly, "is actually quite peaceful." "This moment is the only moment that exists," the monk replied. "Yesterday's caravan has already arrived at its destination. Tomorrow's caravan has not yet departed. Only today's journey requires your attention." When dawn broke over the oasis, painting the sand dunes in shades of rose and gold, Arjun felt as though he was seeing his caravan with new eyes. His employees were not burdens to be carried, but partners in a shared venture. His camels were not symbols of obligation, but magnificent creatures perfectly designed for their purpose. His goods were not weights dragging him down, but gifts connecting distant communities. The transformation was not in his circumstances, which remained exactly as they had been the night before. The change was in his relationship to those circumstances, in his understanding of what belonged to him and what belonged to the larger flow of life itself. As his caravan prepared to depart, Arjun approached each of his men differently than he had before. Instead of seeing them as dependents whose welfare rested entirely on his shoulders, he saw them as capable individuals who had chosen this work because it served their own purposes and dreams. "Hassan," he said to his lead guide, "what is your assessment of the route ahead?" This was a question he had never asked before. Previously, he had always assumed that all decisions were his to make alone. But Hassan's face lit up with an enthusiasm Arjun had not seen in years. "There are two possibilities, Master," Hassan replied eagerly. "The northern route is faster, but carries greater risk of sandstorms this season. The southern route adds 3 days to our journey, but passes through oases, where we can replenish our water supplies. What would you recommend?" Hassan straightened with visible pride at being consulted. "I believe the southern route serves us better. The extra days are a small price for certainty of water." As they set out across the desert, Arjun noticed how much lighter his steps felt despite carrying the same physical load as always. The knot in his stomach had dissolved sometime during the night, replaced by a quality of attention he had not experienced in years. When concerns about future challenges arose in his mind, he found himself asking the monk's question, "Does this require action from me today?" If the answer was yes, he took that action immediately and completely. If the answer was no, he let the concern pass like a cloud across the vast sky of the desert. 3 weeks later, when the caravan arrived safely at its destination, Arjun realized that his business had not suffered from his newfound lightness. If anything, his decision-making had become clearer and more effective. When he was not consumed by imaginary future disasters, he could see actual present opportunities that had previously escaped his notice. The fisherman's perfect catch. Our third tale brings us to a coastal village where the rhythm of waves against ancient stones had marked time for countless generations. Here lived a fisherman named Daiki, whose skill with nets and understanding of tidal patterns made him the most successful provider in his community. But success had planted a seed of discontent in Daiki's heart that grew larger with each passing season. No matter how abundant his catch, no matter how perfectly he read the weather and currents, there was always the fisherman in the neighboring village who seemed to bring in larger nets. There was always someone whose boat returned fuller than his own. This comparison had become Daiki's constant companion, transforming what had once been pure joy in his craft into a relentless pursuit of superiority. He would rise earlier than necessary, push his boat farther from shore than was wise, and cast his nets until his hands bled from the rough rope, all in service of a goal that seemed to retreat like the horizon itself. One morning, after a particularly disappointing night of fishing, Daiki found his nets tangled beyond repair. As he sat on the shore attempting to untangle the mess, his frustration boiled over into anger directed at the ocean itself, at his neighbors, at the very fish for not cooperating with his ambitions. "Why do you struggle so violently against what appears to be cooperation from the sea?" asked a voice behind him. Daiki turned to see an elderly woman he did not recognize, though in a village as small as his, strangers were rare. She wore simple clothes and carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that spoke of wisdom earned rather than learned from books. "Cooperation?" Daiki laughed bitterly. "The sea gives me just enough to survive while blessing others with abundance. If this is cooperation, then the ocean and I have very different understandings of partnership." The woman settled beside him on the sand, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where fishing boats dotted the morning waters like scattered seeds. "Tell me about your most perfect day of fishing," she said. "Not your most profitable day, but the day when everything felt exactly as it should be." Daiki paused in his struggle with the nets, surprised by the question. His mind immediately went to numbers, to the size of catches, and the envy of other fishermen. But something in the woman's tone suggested she was asking about something else entirely. After a long moment, a memory surfaced that he had not considered in years. "There was a morning," he said slowly, "when I was perhaps 20 years old. The water was so still it looked like polished glass. I cast my net without thinking about the catch, just because the motion felt natural. When I pulled it in, there were exactly 7 fish. Not enough to boast about, not enough to sell for much profit. But they were perfect fish, silver and strong, and the whole experience felt like a prayer." "And how did you feel in that moment?" "Complete," Daiki answered without hesitation, then looked surprised at his own response. "I felt complete." The woman nodded as if this was exactly the answer she had expected. "What has changed since then?" Daiki felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest as he considered this question. The memory of that perfect morning seemed to come from a different lifetime, when fishing had been about the relationship between himself and the sea, rather than about comparison with other fishermen. "I suppose I began measuring my worth by my catch, rather than by the quality of my attention," he admitted. "And what has this measurement brought you?" "Endless dissatisfaction," Daiki said, the words emerging with surprising force. "No catch is ever enough. No day feels successful. I have turned the thing I once loved into a source of constant suffering." The woman reached down and picked up a handful of wet sand, letting it slip through her fingers back to the shore. "The ocean gives according to its own wisdom, not according to our demands. When you cast your net with the energy of desperation, what do you think the fish sense?" Daiki had never considered this perspective. He had always thought of fishing as taking from the sea, not as participating in some larger dance of giving and receiving. "I think they sense my grasping," he said quietly. "My need to prove something, rather than simply receive what is offered." "Exactly. And what happens when you approach any relationship with the energy of desperate need?" The truth of this hit Daiki like a wave he hadn't seen coming. He thought of his wife, who had grown distant as his obsession with outdoing other fishermen consumed more and more of his attention. He thought of his children, who no longer ran to greet him when he returned from the sea because they had learned that his mood depended entirely on the size of his catch. The relationship becomes about what I can get, rather than what I can give, he realized aloud. The woman smiled, and Daiki noticed that her eyes held the same quality of depth he had once loved about the ocean, before comparison had clouded his vision. "The sea is not withholding abundance from you," she said gently. "You are withholding your presence from the sea. When you fish with the energy of that 20-year-old boy who cast his net as a prayer, what do you think might happen?" That evening, despite his damaged nets, Daiki decided to take his boat out with equipment borrowed from a neighbor. But instead of heading to his usual spot where he knew other fishermen would be visible for comparison, he sailed to a quiet cove he had discovered as a child but hadn't visited in years. As he prepared to cast his makeshift net, he paused and tried to reconnect with the feeling from that perfect morning decades ago. He noticed the way moonlight painted silver paths across the water's surface. He felt the gentle rocking of his boat as it found its natural rhythm with the waves. He became aware of the vast silence broken only by the soft lapping of water against his hull. When he cast his net, it was not with the frantic energy of someone trying to prove his worth, but with the fluid motion of someone participating in an ancient dance. he found himself whispering a prayer of gratitude to the sea, not for what it might give him, but for the privilege of being part of its eternal rhythm. The net felt different as he pulled it in, not heavier or lighter, but somehow more alive. When he finally brought it aboard, he discovered not the massive catch his ego had been demanding, but exactly what he needed. Enough fish to feed his family well, with a few extra to share with elderly neighbors who could no longer fish for themselves. But more importantly, he had rediscovered the joy that had been buried under years of comparison and competition. The act of fishing itself had become a meditation, a way of connecting with something larger than his individual desires and fears. As he sailed home under stars that seemed brighter than they had in years, Daiki understood that the woman on the beach had taught him something profound about the nature of abundance. True abundance wasn't about having more than others, but about being present enough to receive what was already being offered. Over the following weeks, his relationship with fishing continued to transform. Some days brought larger catches, some smaller, but the quality of his attention remained constant. He found himself naturally sharing techniques with other fishermen, rather than guarding his knowledge as competitive advantages. The ocean seemed to respond to this shift in energy, providing not always what he wanted, but always what was needed. His wife noticed the change first. "You come home differently now," she told him one evening as they prepared the day's catch together. "You smell like salt and satisfaction instead of salt and frustration." His children began meeting him at the shore again, not because they cared about the size of his catch, but because his presence itself had become a source of warmth and stability, rather than anxious energy. The scholar's empty cup. Our fourth story unfolds in the courtyards of an ancient university where the greatest minds of the age gathered to debate philosophy, astronomy, and the mysteries of existence. Among these learned men was Professor Chen, whose reputation for intellectual brilliance had spread across multiple kingdoms. Chen had devoted 30 years to the study of Buddhist texts, memorizing thousands of sutras and engaging in debates that could last for days. His knowledge was encyclopedic, his arguments razor-sharp, his ability to quote obscure passages legendary among his peers. Students traveled from distant lands just to hear him lecture on the subtle points of doctrine. Yet for all his learning, Chen carried within him a growing sense of spiritual emptiness. The more he knew about enlightenment intellectually, the further it seemed to recede from his actual experience. He could discourse brilliantly on the nature of suffering and the path to liberation, but he could not seem to free himself from the persistent anxiety that plagued his daily life. Word reached the university of a simple tea master who lived in the mountains above the city. This tea master was said to possess a profound understanding that transcended all scholarly learning, though he was known to be completely illiterate and had never studied a single religious text. Chen's pride initially rebelled against the idea of seeking instruction from someone so obviously his intellectual inferior. But his desperation eventually overcame his arrogance, and he decided to visit this tea master, if only to demonstrate the superiority of scholarly understanding over folk wisdom. The journey to the tea master's humble dwelling took Chen through narrow mountain paths he had never explored despite living in the city below for decades. As he climbed higher, leaving behind the familiar sounds of academic debate and scholarly discussion, he found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable with the silence. He arrived at sunset to find a small wooden hut surrounded by carefully tended tea gardens. The tea master, a man of perhaps 60 years with weathered hands and gentle eyes, welcomed Chen without ceremony or deference to his scholarly reputation. Master, Chen began, settling onto a simple cushion, I have come to learn about the true nature of enlightenment. I have studied every major text, mastered every philosophical position, yet I feel no closer to actual realization than when I began my studies 30 years ago. The tea master nodded and began preparing tea with movements so graceful and attentive that Chen found himself momentarily distracted from his prepared speech about his scholarly achievements. Would you like some tea? The master asked simply. Yes, certainly. But as I was saying, I have particular expertise in the Madhyamika school of thought, and I've been wondering about the relationship between conceptual understanding and direct experience. The tea master began pouring tea into Chen's cup, but instead of stopping when the cup was full, he continued pouring. The hot tea overflowed onto the table, then onto Chen's robes, causing him to jump back in alarm. Stop, Chen exclaimed. The cup is already full. No more will go in. The tea master set down the pot and looked at Chen with eyes that seemed to hold depths the scholar had never noticed in any of his learned colleagues. Exactly, the tea master said quietly. And just like this cup, you are already so full of knowledge, opinions, and concepts that there is no room for anything new to enter. How can I pour the tea of understanding into a cup that is already overflowing? Chen felt something crack open inside his chest, like ice breaking up in spring. For 30 years, he had been adding layer upon layer of intellectual understanding, never pausing to create space for direct experience. His mind had become like an overstuffed library where no new books could be shelved because every inch was already occupied. But surely knowledge is important? Chen asked, though his voice carried less certainty than it had moments before. The tea master refilled Chen's cup, this time allowing him to drink before speaking again. Knowledge is like this cup, he said. It can be useful for holding tea, but if you become attached to the cup itself, you forget that its value lies in its emptiness. The space inside the cup is what makes it capable of serving its purpose. Chen sipped his tea slowly, noticing for the first time the complex flavors that emerged when he paid attention, rather than simply consuming while thinking about other things. What you call knowledge, the tea master continued, I call yesterday's insights. They were fresh and alive when they first arose in the minds of the ancient teachers, but by the time they reach you through books and lectures, they have become preserved experiences rather than living understanding. Then how does one develop living understanding? The tea master smiled and gestured toward the window where the last light of day was painting the tea gardens in shades of gold and green. By paying attention to what is actually present rather than what you think about what is present. Right now, as you sit here drinking tea, what is your direct experience? Chen paused, realizing that even in this moment he had been analyzing the conversation rather than fully experiencing it. He took a breath and tried to notice what was actually happening beyond his mental commentary. I feel the warmth of the cup in my hands, he said slowly. I can hear birds settling for the night in the trees outside. There's a quality of stillness that feels different from the busy energy of the university. And in this moment of direct experience, where are your 30 years of Buddhist scholarship? Chen looked puzzled for a moment. Then understanding began to dawn. They're not here. In this moment of simply being present, all that knowledge exists only as background. It's not actively interfering with my experience. Exactly. Knowledge becomes wisdom only when it serves presence rather than replacing it. When you quote sutras about the nature of impermanence, while missing the actual impermanence happening right in front of you, knowledge becomes an obstacle to understanding. They sat in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them. Chen found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt in decades. The simple pleasure of being exactly where he was, without needing to analyze, categorize, or improve the experience. "I think I've been trying to think my way to enlightenment," he said finally. "And how has that been working for you?" the tea master asked with gentle humor. Chen laughed, surprising himself. "Not particularly well. I know more about enlightenment than most people, but I'm not sure I'm any more enlightened than when I started." "The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon itself," the tea master said. "All those texts you've studied are fingers pointing toward direct experience. But if you become fascinated with the fingers, you miss what they're pointing toward." When Chen returned to the university the following day, his colleagues immediately noticed a change in his teaching style. Instead of delivering elaborate lectures filled with quotations and references, he began encouraging his students to investigate their own direct experience. "What do you notice about your mind right now as you sit here?" he would ask. Not what the texts say about the mind, but what you can observe directly about your own consciousness in this moment. Some of his more traditionalist colleagues were skeptical of this approach, but Chen's students responded with an enthusiasm he had never seen before. They were discovering that Buddhism was not primarily an intellectual exercise, but a practical investigation into the nature of their own experience. Chen continued visiting the tea master regularly, not to receive more teachings, but to practice the art of empty cup mind. Each visit required him to temporarily set aside his vast accumulation of knowledge and approach each moment with fresh attention. Over time, he discovered that his scholarly learning had not been wasted, but it needed to serve a different function. Instead of being the primary source of his understanding, it became a skillful tool for pointing his students toward their own direct investigation. The transformation was not that Chen became less knowledgeable, but that his knowledge became transparent, allowing direct experience to shine through rather than being obscured by conceptual overlay. Years later, when students asked him about the secret to combining scholarly study with genuine realization, he would simply say, "Keep your cup empty." Knowledge is only valuable when it creates space for wisdom to emerge, not when it fills that space so completely that nothing new can enter. The Merchant's Golden Prison. Our fifth story takes us to a marketplace where the scent of exotic spices mingles with the sound of haggling voices, where fortunes are made and lost with each sunrise. Here we meet Hiroshi, a trader whose success had become legendary throughout the merchant districts of 3 major cities. Hiroshi owned the largest silk trading company in the region, employed over 200 people, and possessed wealth that most could only dream of. His mansion overlooked the harbor, where ships bearing his goods arrived weekly from distant lands. By every external measure, he had achieved everything a merchant could hope for. Yet Hiroshi lived in a state of constant anxiety that grew more intense with each passing year. The larger his business became, the more complex his problems grew. Every decision rippled outward, affecting hundreds of employees and their families. Every market fluctuation threatened to topple the empire he had spent decades building. Success had become a beautiful prison whose bars were made of golden obligations. Sleep had become elusive. Hiroshi would lie awake calculating risks, replaying conversations with business partners, and imagining scenarios where everything he had worked for could disappear overnight. His wife had grown distant. His children barely knew him. And the joy he had once felt in the art of trading had been replaced by the grim determination of someone fighting to keep his head above rising waters. One evening, as Hiroshi sat in his luxurious study surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, a servant announced that an old monk was at the door requesting shelter for the night. Hiroshi's first instinct was to refuse. He had no time for religious visitors and their requests for donations. But something about his current state of desperation made him curious about perspectives that existed outside the world of commerce. The monk who entered was unlike the polished temple priests Hiroshi occasionally encountered at social functions. This man's robes were patched and travel-worn, his possessions limited to a simple bowl and walking staff. Yet he carried himself with a quality of contentment that Hiroshi found both puzzling and somehow enviable. "Master," Hiroshi said, gesturing for the monk to sit on a cushion across from his desk, "I can offer you food and lodging for the night, but I must ask something in return. I am a successful merchant, yet I find no peace in my success. The more I achieve, the more burdensome my life becomes. Perhaps you can offer some insight into this contradiction." The monk settled onto the cushion with fluid grace and studied Hiroshi's face with eyes that seemed to see beyond surface appearances. "Tell me," the monk said, "what did you love about trading when you first began?" Hiroshi was surprised by the question. His mind immediately went to profit margins and market advantages, but something in the monk's tone suggested he was being asked about something deeper. After a long pause, a memory surfaced from his early days as a young apprentice in his father's modest shop. "I loved the connections," he said slowly, surprised by his own answer. "I loved learning about the places where our goods originated, imagining the hands that had crafted each item. I loved the moment when a customer's eyes lit up because we had exactly what they were seeking. Each transaction felt like a small bridge being built between distant worlds. And now?" Hiroshi felt something tighten in his chest as he considered the question. "Now each transaction is primarily about numbers. Profit margins, market share, competitive advantages. I rarely interact directly with customers anymore. Most days I never even see the goods we're trading. What changed? I suppose I began measuring success by accumulation rather than by connection. The business became about having more rather than serving better." The monk nodded as if this was exactly the answer he had expected. "And what has this accumulation brought you?" "Wealth, certainly. Security for my family. Respect in the community." Hiroshi paused, recognizing how hollow these achievements felt as he spoke them aloud. "But also constant worry, isolation from the people I love, and the loss of joy in work that once felt like play." "You speak of security," the monk observed gently, "yet you seem to live in a state of constant insecurity. You speak of wealth, yet you appear impoverished in spirit. How do you explain this paradox?" Hiroshi found himself unable to answer immediately. The contradiction the monk had pointed out was so obvious, yet he had never seen it clearly before. "I think," he said finally, "I have been trying to create security through control, but the more I try to control, the more things seem to slip beyond my influence." "Exactly. You have been building walls to protect what you love, but walls that keep danger out also keep life from flowing in. Your business has become a fortress, and you have become its prisoner." The monk reached into his simple traveling bag and withdrew a small, perfectly ordinary stone. He placed it on the desk between them. "This stone owns nothing," he said quietly. "It controls nothing. It accumulates nothing. Yet it lacks nothing it truly needs. It exists in perfect harmony with its circumstances, neither grasping for more nor rejecting what is present." Hiroshi stared at the stone, feeling something shift in his understanding. "But surely you're not suggesting I should abandon all responsibility and live like a stone?" The monk smiled. "I'm suggesting you might consider the difference between responsibility and ownership, between stewardship and possession, between participating in the flow of commerce and trying to dam that flow for your personal benefit. I don't understand the distinction. When you were young and loved the connections your business created, were you trying to own those connections or simply facilitate them?" "I was facilitating them," Hiroshi realized. "I saw myself as a bridge between people who had what others needed. And now I try to own every aspect of every transaction. I try to control outcomes that depend on factors far beyond my influence. I've turned myself from a bridge into a bottleneck." The monk picked up the stone and held it in his palm. "What if you could return to being a bridge? What if your business could serve the natural flow of commerce rather than trying to control it?" That night, Hiroshi slept more peacefully than he had in years. He dreamed not of ledgers and profit margins, but of the young apprentice who had found joy in connecting distant worlds through simple acts of trade. When morning came, he began experimenting with a different approach to his business. Instead of starting each day by reviewing financial reports and competitive analyses, he began by visiting his warehouses to reconnect with the actual goods his company traded. He started spending time with customers, rediscovering the satisfaction that came from matching their needs with appropriate products. Most significantly, he began delegating responsibilities he had been clutching tightly, recognizing that his attempts to control every detail had been strangling the natural vitality of his organization. His managers, given more authority to make decisions, began showing initiative and creativity that had been suppressed under his micromanagement. The transformation was not immediate, but over the following months, Hiroshi discovered something remarkable. When he stopped trying to own and control every aspect of his business, it actually became more profitable and much more enjoyable. By returning to his original role as a facilitator rather than a controller, he had unleashed energies that his grasping had been blocking. His relationships with his family began to heal as the constant anxiety that had made him difficult to live with gradually dissolved. His employees noticed the change in his energy and responded with increased loyalty and enthusiasm. Years later, when other merchants asked Hiroshi about the secret to his success and apparent contentment, he would show them a small stone he kept on his desk. "This stone taught me the difference between having a business and being imprisoned by one," he would say. "True wealth flows through open hands, not clenched fists." The painter's invisible masterpiece. In a mountain village where morning clouds drifted through narrow streets like wandering spirits, there lived an artist named Keiko, whose paintings were sought after by collectors from the imperial court itself. Her scrolls depicting cherry blossoms and mountain landscapes commanded prices that supported not only her own household, but several apprentices who came to learn her techniques. Yet Keiko harbored a secret shame that gnawed at her heart like a persistent hunger. Despite her technical mastery and commercial success, she felt like a fraud who had learned to mimic beauty without ever truly understanding its essence. Each brushstroke felt calculated, each composition formulaic. She could create paintings that others admired, but she could no longer remember the last time her own work had moved her to tears. The problem had begun subtly, years earlier, when her paintings first started selling for significant sums. Gradually, she found herself painting not what stirred her soul, but what she knew would appeal to buyers. Market considerations crept into her creative process like weeds choking a garden. The spontaneous joy that had once guided her brush had been replaced by the careful calculation of commercial appeal. One autumn evening, as Keiko sat staring at a half-finished painting that felt as lifeless as dried leaves, she heard music drifting from the village square. Following the sound, she discovered an elderly man playing a simple wooden flute for a small gathering of children and their parents. His instrument was crude, obviously handmade, and his clothes marked him as someone of modest means. Yet the music that emerged from his flute carried something that Keiko's paintings had lost. Each note seemed to arise directly from his heart, unfiltered by concern for how it might be received. The melody was simple, even repetitive, but it created a quality of presence that made the entire square feel sacred. When the music ended and the small crowd dispersed, Keiko approached the old musician. "Master," she said, bowing respectfully, "I am a painter who has lost her way. Your music carries something mine has forgotten. Might you share what allows you to create with such authenticity?" The old man studied her face with eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding far beyond what his simple appearance might suggest. "What do you paint?" he asked. "Landscapes, flowers, birds, whatever sells well in the markets." "Ah," he nodded knowingly. "And what would you paint if no one would ever buy your work? If no one would ever see it? If you painted only for the joy of painting itself?" Keiko felt something stir in her chest, a recognition of a question she had not asked herself in years. Images began arising in her mind that had nothing to do with market appeal. The way frost formed intricate patterns on her window each winter morning. The expression in her grandmother's eyes during their last conversation. The quality of light that filled her studio during the brief moments between sunset and darkness. "I would paint memories," she said softly. "Moments that moved me so deeply I wanted to preserve them somehow. Not because they were beautiful in a conventional sense, but because they contained something true." The old musician smiled and began cleaning his simple flute with gentle care. "There is your answer," he said. "I play this flute not because I am skilled, though skill has its place. I play because music is how I pray. Each note is a conversation with something larger than myself. When you painted those memories you spoke of, were you not also praying?" The question hit Keiko like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of recognition through her consciousness. She remembered the reverent attention she had once brought to her art, the sense of participating in something sacred rather than simply producing objects for consumption. "I was praying," she agreed, feeling tears well up unexpectedly. "I had forgotten that painting could be prayer." "The market can buy your paintings," the musician continued, "but it cannot buy your prayer. When you paint to please buyers, you offer them the shell of art while keeping the essence for yourself. But when you paint as prayer, the essence flows into the work, and those who encounter it receive something they did not even know they were seeking." That night, Keiko returned to her studio and did something she had not done in years. She removed the half-finished commercial piece from her easel and replaced it with a blank scroll. Then she began painting without any plan or intention beyond expressing the quality of presence she had felt listening to the old man's music. Her brush moved differently than it had in months. Instead of calculating each stroke's effect on the overall composition, she found herself responding to what emerged naturally from the interaction between ink and paper. She painted not the perfect cherry blossom that would sell well, but the single imperfect petal she had watched fall from the tree outside her window that morning. Hours passed without her awareness. When she finally stepped back from the scroll, she discovered something remarkable. The painting was technically imperfect by the standards she had been applying to her commercial work. The brushwork was looser, the composition less balanced according to traditional rules. Yet it pulsed with a vitality that her technically superior pieces had lacked. More importantly, she had rediscovered the joy that had first drawn her to painting. The act itself had become meditation, a way of participating in the flow of creation rather than trying to control it. Over the following weeks, Keiko began dividing her time between two types of work. She continued creating paintings for sale, but now she approached them with less attachment to outcome and more attention to the process itself. And she began keeping a private collection of paintings that were never intended for anyone else's eyes, works that emerged purely from her need to express what moved her most deeply. Paradoxically, as she became less concerned with market appeal, her commercial work began improving. The authentic presence she cultivated in her private paintings began flowing into her public work, giving it a quality that buyers found more compelling than her previous technically perfect but spiritually empty pieces. The Gardener's Withered Roses, our seventh story, takes us to the estate gardens of a wealthy family where every pathway was perfectly maintained and every flower bed arranged with mathematical precision. The head gardener, Matsuo, took immense pride in creating outdoor spaces that looked like living paintings, where not a single leaf was out of place. Matsuo's reputation extended far beyond the estate where he worked. Other wealthy families would visit specifically to admire his gardens, and several had attempted to lure him away with promises of higher wages and grander estates to tend. His ability to coax extraordinary beauty from the earth seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed his work. But Matsuo carried a burden that no visitor to his gardens could see. His perfectionism had become a tyranny that drained all joy from the work he had once loved. Every imperfection in his carefully planned landscapes felt like a personal failure. A single yellowing leaf could ruin his entire day. Weather that damaged his arrangements sent him into fits of rage that frightened even his closest assistants. The breaking point came during the preparation for his employer's daughter's wedding. Matsuo had spent months planning an elaborate rose garden that would serve as the backdrop for the ceremony. Every variety had been chosen for its color, fragrance, and blooming schedule. Every plant had been positioned to create the perfect visual composition. 3 days before the wedding, a late spring frost struck without warning. When Matsuo arrived at the garden that morning, he found his masterpiece in ruins. The roses that should have been at their peak bloom were blackened and withered. Months of meticulous planning had been destroyed in a single night. Matsuo's assistants found him sitting among the ruined roses, weeping with a grief that seemed disproportionate to the loss of flowers. One of them, an elderly man who had worked gardens for 50 years, sat down beside his devastated supervisor. "Master Matsuo," the old gardener said gently, "may I share something my grandfather taught me when I was young?" Matsuo looked up with eyes red from crying and exhaustion. "My grandfather was also a gardener," the old man continued, "and he once told me that there are two types of gardens. There are gardens we create to impress others, where every element exists to serve our vision of perfection. And there are gardens we tend in partnership with nature, where we offer our skill and care, but accept that the final result belongs to forces larger than ourselves." "But how can I face my employer?" Matsuo asked. "How can I explain that months of preparation have come to nothing?" The old assistant smiled with the patience of someone who had seen many seasons of planting and harvesting. "Perhaps the question is not how to explain failure, but how to discover what success actually means. These roses that froze, did they suffer because they failed to meet your expectations? Matsuo looked around at the blackened blooms, considering the question seriously for the first time since discovering the damage. No, he said slowly. They bloomed exactly as roses bloom. They gave their beauty fully when conditions allowed it. The frost was not their enemy, but simply another force of nature, like the sun and rain that helped them grow. Exactly. And you, Master Matsuo, are also part of nature. Your skill and care are gifts you offer to the garden, but the final result emerges from the collaboration between your efforts and forces beyond your control. When you take complete credit for success, you must also take complete blame for what you call failure. That afternoon, instead of attempting to replant the entire rose garden in the 3 days remaining before the wedding, Matsuo made a radical decision. He gathered his assistants and began creating something entirely different. Using the structure of the existing garden but incorporating the frost-damaged plants rather than removing them, they created an arrangement that told the story of resilience and adaptation. The blackened roses were left in place, but surrounded by hardy flowering shrubs that had survived the frost. Pathways were lined with plants known for their ability to recover from damage. The overall effect was less conventionally beautiful than Matsuo's original plan, but it carried a quality of authenticity and natural wisdom that moved visitors in unexpected ways. When the wedding day arrived, guests found themselves drawn not to perfect blooms, but to a garden that seemed to embody the very essence of commitment through changing seasons. The bride's grandmother, a woman known for her sharp eye and sharper tongue, declared it the most meaningful garden she had ever encountered. "This garden knows something about love," she said to Matsuo as the ceremony concluded. "It shows that true beauty isn't about avoiding difficulties, but about finding grace in the midst of them." Matsuo felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of his craft. The garden that had emerged from apparent disaster taught him more about working with natural forces than all his years of trying to impose his will upon them. From that day forward, his approach to gardening transformed completely. He continued to plan and design with skill and care, but he held his plans lightly, remaining open to the unexpected gifts that emerged when human intention collaborated with natural wisdom rather than trying to dominate it. Years later, visitors to his gardens would often comment on their unique quality of peaceful vitality. When asked about his secret, Matsuo would point to a section where frost-damaged roses still bloomed alongside the plants that had grown up to support them. "I learned to garden with nature rather than against it," he would say. "The most beautiful gardens are the ones that know how to dance with whatever weather comes." The merchant's generous enemy. Our 8th tale brings us to the competitive world of the spice trade, where merchant families had maintained rivalries that stretched back generations. In the bustling port city of Hakata, 2 trading houses had been locked in bitter competition for over 30 years, each trying to undercut the other's prices and steal away customers. The head of the Tanaka family trading house was a man named Ichiro, whose animosity toward the rival Yoshida family had become the driving force of his business decisions. Every morning he would send servants to spy on Yoshida activities, gathering intelligence about their supply routes, pricing strategies, and customer relationships. Every evening, he would plot ways to gain advantages over his hated competitors. This obsession had consumed Ichiro's life so completely that his own family barely knew him. His children had grown up hearing more about the evil machinations of the Yoshida clan than about their father's hopes for their future. His wife had learned not to expect his attention during meals, as his mind was perpetually occupied with schemes to destroy his business rivals. The feud intensified when both families bid on an exclusive contract to supply spices to a wealthy temple complex. The contract would provide steady income for years and establish the winning family as the dominant spice trader in the region. Ichiro devoted months to preparing his proposal, neglecting other aspects of his business in his determination to defeat the Yoshidas once and for all. When the temple announced that the Yoshida family had won the contract, Ichiro's rage knew no bounds. He accused them of bribery, of providing inferior goods, of using underhanded tactics that no honorable merchant would employ. His bitterness poisoned the atmosphere of his household and began affecting his judgment in other business matters. 3 months after this devastating loss, disaster struck Ichiro's family in a way that had nothing to do with business competition. A fire swept through the warehouse district, destroying not only the Tanaka family's main storage facility, but also their entire inventory of expensive spices imported from distant lands. In a single night, decades of accumulated wealth went up in smoke. As Ichiro stood among the ashes of his livelihood, contemplating bankruptcy and the ruin of his family's reputation, something unexpected happened. A cart loaded with spices pulled up to the remains of his warehouse. The driver, wearing the colors of the Yoshida trading house, began unloading sacks of cardamom, cinnamon, and black pepper. Ichiro's first assumption was that his rivals had come to gloat over his misfortune. But when the head of the Yoshida family, Kenji, approached with several of his employees, his expression held no trace of satisfaction or mockery. "Tanaka-san," Kenji said with a formal bow, "we heard about the fire. These spices should be enough to keep your business operating until you can rebuild your inventory. Consider it a loan to be repaid when your circumstances improve." Ichiro stood speechless, unable to process what he was witnessing. The man he had considered his greatest enemy was offering assistance in his moment of greatest vulnerability. "Why?" was the only word Ichiro could manage to speak. Kenji's answer came with quiet dignity. "Because without the Tanaka family to keep us sharp, the Yoshida family grows complacent. Competition has made both our businesses stronger over the years. If you fail, we lose the challenge that has pushed us to constant improvement." But there was something in Kenji's eyes that suggested his motivations ran deeper than business strategy. "Also," Kenji continued more softly, "because 30 years ago, when my father was starting our business and nearly failed due to a shipment lost at sea, your father extended credit that kept our family from bankruptcy. You may not remember as you were young then, but I have never forgotten that kindness." Ichiro felt something crack open in his chest, like ice breaking up in spring. The revelation that his own father had once helped the family he now considered his enemies completely reframed everything he thought he understood about their relationship. "But we have been such bitter rivals," Ichiro said, confusion evident in his voice. "I have spent years plotting against your family, trying to undermine your success." Kenji smiled with genuine warmth. "And I have known this, just as you have known that we were working equally hard to outcompete you. But rivalry and hatred are different things. I have always respected your skill as a merchant, even when we were fighting over the same customers." In the weeks that followed, as Ichiro slowly rebuilt his business with the help of his former enemy's generosity, he began to understand the profound difference between healthy competition and consuming hatred. The rivalry between their families had indeed made both businesses stronger, but his personal animosity had been poisoning his own life without providing any corresponding benefit. When he was finally able to repay the loan of spices, Ichiro approached Kenji with a proposal that surprised both their families. "What if we maintained our business competition but ended our personal enmity?" he suggested. "What if we could challenge each other to excellence without the burden of hatred?" The transformation in both families was remarkable. The energy that had been consumed by plotting and scheming was redirected into genuine innovation and customer service. Both businesses flourished in ways they had never achieved when focused primarily on destroying each other. Ichiro discovered that his children were far more interested in learning about the spice trade when it was presented as a noble craft rather than as a weapon against enemies. His wife began enjoying family meals again when conversation turned to interesting developments in distant markets rather than endless complaints about competitor treachery. Most surprisingly, Ichiro found that having Kenji as a respected rival rather than a hated enemy actually made business more enjoyable. Their competition became a kind of game between masters of their craft, each pushing the other to new levels of excellence. Years later, when visitors to the port city remarked on the unusually high quality of spices available from both trading houses, Ichiro and Kenji would exchange knowing smiles. "Competition without hatred," Ichiro would explain, "produces excellence. Competition fueled by hatred produces only exhaustion." The fire that had seemed like the worst disaster of Ichiro's life had actually freed him from a prison of his own making, showing him the difference between being challenged by others and being consumed by animosity toward them. The Weaver's Broken Thread. Our ninth story unfolds in a village renowned for its exquisite textiles, where the sound of looms created a constant rhythmic backdrop to daily life. Among the master weavers lived a woman named Yuki, whose silk tapestries were so intricate and beautiful that they adorned the walls of noble houses throughout the kingdom. Yuki had inherited her loom from her grandmother, and her skill from years of patient practice under her mother's guidance. Each tapestry she created was a meditation in thread and color, requiring months of careful attention to detail. Her reputation had been built on the perfection of her work, where not a single thread was out of place, and every pattern flowed with mathematical precision. But Yuki's pursuit of perfection had gradually transformed from joyful craftsmanship into anxious obsession. She would spend hours examining her work for the slightest imperfections, often unraveling entire sections to correct flaws that no one else could even detect. The pleasure she had once found in the rhythmic motion of weaving had been replaced by the constant tension of trying to achieve an impossible standard. The crisis came while working on her most ambitious project ever, a ceremonial tapestry commissioned for the emperor's palace. The piece was to depict the 4 seasons in a continuous, flowing narrative, requiring unprecedented technical complexity and artistic vision. Yuki had been working on it for 8 months, pouring every ounce of her skill and creativity into creating what she hoped would be her masterpiece. On a humid summer morning, as she worked on the delicate transition between spring blossoms and summer foliage, disaster struck. A single thread snapped near the center of the tapestry, creating a small but noticeable flaw in what had been flawless work. The break occurred in such a way that repairing it would require unraveling weeks of intricate weaving. Yuki stared at the broken thread in horror, feeling her months of careful work reduced to ruin by this single imperfection. Her first instinct was to begin the painstaking process of unraveling and reweaving, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was exhaustion from months of obsessive perfectionism, or perhaps it was a deeper wisdom that chose that moment to surface. Instead of immediately beginning repairs, Yuki set aside her tools and walked to the village temple, where she often went to pray when facing difficult decisions. The old priest, who had known her since childhood, noticed her distressed appearance. "Child," he said gently, "what troubles you so deeply?" Yuki explained about the broken thread and her dilemma. Should she spend weeks repairing the flaw, or should she abandon the project entirely rather than present imperfect work to the emperor? The priest listened thoughtfully, then led her to a wall where an ancient tapestry hung, its colors faded but still beautiful after centuries of existence. "Do you see this tapestry?" he asked. "It was woven by my great-great-grandmother over 300 years ago. Look closely at it." As Yuki examined the ancient work, she began to notice something remarkable. The tapestry was full of small imperfections, places where threads had broken and been repaired, sections where the pattern varied slightly from perfect symmetry, areas where the weaver had clearly adapted to unexpected challenges in the material. "But these flaws," Yuki said, "they don't detract from the beauty. Somehow they seem to add character, to make it more alive." The priest smiled knowingly. "My ancestor was also a perfectionist when she was young, but she learned something that transformed not only her weaving, but her entire approach to life. She learned that perfection is not the absence of flaws, but the skillful incorporation of whatever arises into something beautiful. But surely the emperor expects perfection." "The emperor has many perfect things in his palace," the priest replied. "Jade carvings without a single blemish, gold work of mathematical precision, paintings that follow every rule of classical composition. But perfection can become sterile, cold. What the emperor lacks in his collection is something that speaks to the human heart, something that acknowledges that true beauty emerges from the dance between intention and circumstance." Yuki returned to her loom with a completely different perspective on the broken thread. Instead of seeing it as a flaw to be hidden or corrected, she began to see it as an opportunity for creative adaptation. She studied the break carefully, then began weaving around it in a way that transformed the imperfection into an integral part of the design. The broken thread became the starting point for a small bird that seemed to be taking flight from the spring blossoms into the summer sky. The repair threads, slightly different in color from the original, created a subtle variation that made the bird appear to shimmer with movement. What had been a devastating flaw became the most dynamic and engaging element of the entire tapestry. As she continued working, Yuki found herself approaching the entire project with new freedom. She began incorporating small intentional variations and spontaneous adaptations that made the piece feel more alive and organic than anything she had created before. When the tapestry was finally completed and delivered to the palace, the emperor's response exceeded all expectations. He declared it the most beautiful textile work he had ever encountered, specifically praising the lifelike quality of the small bird that seemed ready to fly from the fabric. "This piece has a soul," he told his court. "Unlike the technically perfect works I usually receive, this one speaks to something deeper than mere appreciation. It reminds me that true beauty lies not in the absence of challenges, but in how skillfully we dance with the challenges that arise." Yuki's approach to her craft was forever changed by the lesson of the broken thread. She continued to work with great skill and attention to detail, but she no longer demanded impossible perfection from herself or her materials. When unexpected challenges arose in her work, she learned to see them as invitations for creative adaptation rather than disasters to be eliminated. Her subsequent tapestries became known not just for their technical excellence, but for their vitality and emotional resonance. Other weavers would travel great distances to learn from her, and she would always share the same fundamental lesson. Perfect technique serves the work, but perfectionist anxiety strangers it. Learn to dance with whatever arises, and your craft will come alive in ways you never imagined. Years later, visitors to her workshop would often ask about the small bird that appeared in many of her tapestries, apparent imperfection in the surrounding from some always-seen pattern. Fading to emerge bird, Yuki would explain with a smile, represents the moment I learned that flaws are just perfection waiting to be discovered by a creative eye. The monk's stolen peace. Our 10th story takes us to a mountain monastery where monks dedicated their lives to meditation and the pursuit of inner tranquility. Among these contemplatives lived a brother named Dogen, who had achieved a reputation for unusual young age. His meditation was spiritual depth despite his relatively profound. His understanding of the Dharma sophisticated, and his presence radiated a quality of peace that influenced everyone around him. Yet Dogen harbored a secret torment that he shared with no one. His serenity was fragile, dependent on maintaining the perfectly controlled environment of the monastery. Any disruption to his carefully regulated routine would send him into internal chaos that he worked desperately to hide from his fellow monks. He lived in constant fear that someone would discover he was not as enlightened as he appeared. Dogen's anxiety was his attachment to be the source of to a particular meditation cushion that had belonged to his beloved teacher before the old master's death. This cushion had become a sacred object for Dogen, and he could only achieve deep meditative states when sitting had convinced himself that his upon it. He teacher's wisdom somehow resided in the fabric, and that losing access to it would mean losing his connection to authentic spiritual practice. Every morning, Dogen would rise early to claim his special cushion before other monks arrived in the meditation hall. Every evening, he would carefully position it in the exact spot where he intended to sit the following day. His entire spiritual life revolved around maintaining possession of this single object. Though he told himself his attachment was really devotion to his teacher's memory. One morning, Dogen arrived at the meditation hall to discover that his cushion was missing. In its place sat another monk, Jishin, who was known for his carefree attitude and unconventional approach to monastic life. Jishin was sitting on Dogen's precious cushion with apparent complete comfort, already deep in meditation, as other monks began filing into the hall. Dogen felt panic rise in his chest, like floodwater. Without his special cushion, he was certain he would be unable to meditate properly. The entire day's practice would be ruined. And worse, other monks might notice his distress and realize that his reputation for spiritual stability was a facade. As the meditation session began, Dogen found himself sitting on an ordinary cushion, but his mind was anything but ordinary. Instead of the peaceful absorption he usually achieved, his consciousness was a whirlwind of angry thoughts directed at Jishin, self-pity about his spiritual bad luck, and mounting anxiety about his loss, and growing anxiety about his inability to settle into meditation. Throughout the sitting period, Dogen's mind created elaborate narratives about Jishin's motivations. Perhaps the other monk had deliberately stolen the cushion out of jealousy. Perhaps he knew about Dogen's attachment and was testing him. Perhaps this was some form of spiritual persecution designed to undermine his practice. When the meditation bell rang to end the session, Dogen approached Jishin with barely contained agitation. "Brother," he said, attempting to keep his voice level, "I believe you may be sitting on my meditation cushion. It belonged to my teacher, and I have used it for my practice for several years." Jishin looked up with genuinely surprised eyes. "Your cushion?" "I apologize, brother. I arrived early and simply sat on the first cushion I encountered. I had no idea it held special significance for you." The simplicity of Jishin's explanation deflated Dogen's elaborate theories about deliberate persecution. But somehow this made him feel even worse. If the theft had been intentional, at least he could have maintained his anger as a distraction from his deeper anxiety. But if it was merely an innocent mistake, then his entire morning of mental torment had been self-created. "Of course," Dogen replied, forcing a smile. "No harm done. Perhaps I could use it for this evening's sitting." But when evening came, Jishin was already seated on the cushion again, apparently having forgotten their morning conversation entirely. This pattern continued for several days, with Dogen growing increasingly desperate, but unable to directly confront what he saw as his growing spiritual crisis. On the fourth day, the monastery's abbot, Roshi Hakuin, noticed Dogen's obvious distress and called him to his private quarters. "My son," the abbot said gently, "something is troubling you deeply. Your usual peaceful presence has been replaced by an energy of barely contained agitation. What burden are you carrying?" Unable to maintain his facade any longer, Dogen poured out the entire story of his attachment to the cushion, his inability to meditate without it, and his growing fear that he was not the accomplished practitioner others believed him to be. The abbot listened without judgment, occasionally nodding with understanding. When Dogen finished his confession, Roshi Hakuin was quiet for several minutes before speaking. "Tell me," the abbot finally said, "when you first began practicing with your teacher before you developed this attachment to his cushion, how was your meditation?" Dogen paused, accessing memories from years earlier. "It was free. Sometimes profound, sometimes difficult, but always authentic. I sat wherever there was space and found that meditation arose naturally from sincere intention rather than from external conditions." "And what changed?" "I suppose I began to believe that my deepening practice was connected to the cushion rather than to my own developing understanding. The cushion became a talisman that I thought contained some essential ingredient for authentic meditation." The abbot smiled with the gentle compassion that comes from having observed the patterns of spiritual seeking for many decades. "Your teacher's wisdom was not stored in that cushion, my son. It was transmitted through his presence, his teachings, and his example. But most importantly, it was received and integrated by your own mind and heart. The cushion is just fabric stuffed with rice hulls." "But my meditation has been so disturbed without it," Dogen protested. "Your meditation has been disturbed by your attachment to it," the abbot corrected gently. "The cushion itself has no power to grant or withhold spiritual states. When you sit on it believing it will enhance your practice, you create a certain mental condition. When you cannot access it and believe this will diminish your practice, you create a different mental condition. In both cases, it is your belief, not the cushion, that shapes your experience." The abbot rose and walked to a simple wooden box in the corner of his room. From it he withdrew a meditation cushion so worn and patched that its original color was barely discernible. "This cushion," he said, "belonged to the founder of our monastery, a master whose realization was legendary. By your logic, sitting on this cushion should guarantee immediate enlightenment." He placed the ancient cushion on the floor and invited Dogen to sit on it. "Tell me what special powers you experience." Dogen settled onto the historic cushion and closed his eyes, expecting some profound shift in consciousness. Instead, he experienced exactly what he had experienced on every other cushion over the past few days: a mind agitated by attachment and expectation. "I feel nothing special," he admitted with some embarrassment. "Exactly. Because the power was never in any cushion. The capacity for deep meditation lies within your own awareness, which is always present regardless of what you sit on or where you sit." That evening, Dogen deliberately chose to sit on a different cushion from any he had used before. Instead of trying to recreate his familiar meditative states, he simply observed whatever arose in his mind without resistance or grasping. To his surprise, this acceptance of his current experience, rather than longing for a previous one, allowed a natural settling that was deeper than anything he had achieved in weeks. Over the following days, he experimented with sitting in different locations, on different cushions, and even occasionally standing or walking during meditation periods. What he discovered revolutionized his understanding of spiritual practice. Authentic meditation was not about creating perfect conditions, but about meeting whatever conditions were present with complete acceptance. His attachment to the special cushion had been a subtle form of spiritual materialism, believing that awakening could be possessed through objects rather than realized through awareness itself. When he finally encountered Jishin sitting on his original cushion again, Dogen felt no trace of his previous agitation. Instead, he felt genuine gratitude toward the monk who had unknowingly freed him from a prison of his own making. "Brother Jishin," he said, approaching after the meditation session, "I want to thank you." Jishin looked puzzled. "Thank me for what?" "For showing me that I had become a slave to my own spiritual comforts. By sitting on that cushion, you forced me to discover that everything I needed for authentic practice was already within me." Years later, when students asked Dogen about the secret to stable meditation practice, he would tell them about the cushion that had taught him the difference between spiritual tools and spiritual crutches. "Use whatever supports your practice," he would advise, "but hold it all lightly." The moment you believe your realization depends on external conditions, those conditions become obstacles to the very realization they were meant to serve. The cushion still sits in the meditation hall, used by whoever arrives first each morning. Sometimes it is Dogen who sits on it, sometimes other monks, and sometimes visitors to the monastery. But it has returned to being what it always was, simply a comfortable place to sit while exploring the limitless space of awareness that belongs to no object and depends on no condition. The baker's perfect loaf. Our 11th story takes us to a village where the aroma of fresh bread drew people from neighboring settlements each morning. The baker, Saburo, had inherited his trade from 3 generations of master bakers, and his skill in creating bread had elevated what might have been mere sustenance into something approaching art. Saburo's loaves were renowned for their perfect crust, their light and airy interior, and their ability to remain fresh for days longer than bread from other bakers. His secret lay not just in technique, but in an almost spiritual devotion to his craft. He would rise at midnight to begin the slow process of kneading and fermentation, speaking quietly to his dough as if it were a living thing that responded to his attention and care. But Saburo's dedication had gradually transformed into an obsession that consumed his entire existence. Every loaf had to meet his exacting standards, and any that fell short were discarded rather than sold. His reputation for perfection had become a prison that left no room for the natural variations that occur in any living process. The crisis began when Saburo's aging hands started developing arthritis. The pain made his usual precise kneading technique impossible, and his bread began showing subtle but noticeable differences from its previous perfection. The crust was sometimes slightly uneven, the interior occasionally denser than usual, the shape not quite as uniform as customers had come to expect. To Saburo, these minor variations felt like catastrophic failures. He would spend entire nights remaking batches that others would have considered perfectly acceptable, driving himself to exhaustion in pursuit of standards that his changing body could no longer consistently achieve. One morning, after discarding an entire day's production because the loaves didn't meet his impossible criteria, Saburo collapsed from exhaustion in his bakery. His neighbor, an old woman named Grandmother Sato, who had been buying his bread for 20 years, found him there and helped him to a chair. "Saburo-san," she said with the gentle authority that comes with age and wisdom, "what has happened to you? You look like a man who has been fighting a war." Through tears of frustration and physical pain, Saburo explained his struggles with his failing technique and his inability to maintain the standards that had made his bread famous throughout the region. Grandmother Sato listened patiently, then picked up one of the loaves he had discarded as inadequate. She examined it carefully, breaking off a small piece to taste. "This bread," she said slowly, "is delicious. It has character that your previous perfect loaves sometimes lacked. There is something about the slight irregularity that makes it feel more alive." "But it's imperfect," Saburo protested. "The crust is uneven, the shape irregular. My customers expect better from me." "Your customers," Grandmother Sato replied gently, "expect bread that nourishes them and brings them joy. They don't expect you to sacrifice your health and sanity to maintain an impossible standard that exists mainly in your own mind." She took another bite of the supposedly flawed bread, savoring it thoughtfully. "Do you know what I taste in this loaf that I never tasted in your previous work?" she asked. "I taste the story of hands that have kneaded thousands of loaves, hands that now carry the wisdom of experience even as they carry the pain of age. This bread has character because it was made by someone with character." Saburo looked at the woman who had been a loyal customer for decades, trying to understand what she was telling him. "But surely consistency is important in any craft." "Consistency of care, yes," she agreed. "Consistency of intention, certainly. But consistency of outcome? That's fighting against the very nature of working with living ingredients in an ever-changing world." Grandmother Sato gestured toward the window where the morning light was just beginning to illuminate the village. "Look at those cherry trees that bloom each spring. Every year the blossoms are beautiful, but no 2 years are exactly the same. Some years they're fuller, some years they're more delicate. Some years they're touched by late frost that creates unexpected patterns. Do we love them less because they're not identical each season?" Over the following weeks, with Grandmother Sato's encouragement, Saburo began experimenting with a different approach to his craft. Instead of fighting against the limitations imposed by his aging hands, he learned to work with them. He developed new techniques that accommodated his reduced dexterity, while still producing bread of exceptional quality. More importantly, he began to see the variations in his bread not as failures, but as expressions of the natural relationship between baker, ingredients, and circumstances. Some days the humidity affected fermentation in ways that created unexpected flavors. Some days his hands moved differently, creating textures that were novel rather than wrong. His customers noticed the change immediately. The bread was still excellent, but it had gained something that perfection had somehow lacked. There was a warmth and humanity in it that spoke to people's hearts, as well as satisfying their hunger. A young apprentice baker from a neighboring village came to study with Saburo and was surprised by what he found. "Master," the young man said, "I came expecting to learn the secrets of making perfect bread. But your loaves vary from day to day. How do you maintain your reputation with such inconsistency?" Saburo smiled, his hands working dough that would become tomorrow's bread. "I used to make perfect bread," he replied. "Now I make honest bread. Perfect bread tries to deny that it's made by human hands in a world of changing conditions. Honest bread celebrates that fact." The apprentice watched as Saburo's arthritic hands worked the dough with movements that were less fluid than they once had been, but somehow more expressive. "Each loaf tells the story of the day it was made," Saburo continued. "The weather, the condition of the grain, the state of my hands and heart. When I tried to make every loaf identical, I was trying to remove the human element from a fundamentally human craft." Years later, when people traveled from distant villages to taste Saburo's famous bread, they would often comment on its unique character. When asked for the secret to his success, Saburo would hold up his gnarled, arthritis-marked hands. "These hands taught me that perfection is not the absence of variation," he would say. "It is the presence of love and attention in whatever form they happen to take." Tani, the teacher's silent student. Our 12th story brings us to a school where the most learned scholars gathered to debate philosophy and share the wisdom of ages. Master Takeshi was known throughout the region for his brilliant lectures on Buddhist principles, drawing students from distant provinces who would travel for weeks just to sit in his classroom. Among his many eager pupils sat one student who puzzled everyone, including the master himself. Keisuke never spoke during discussions, never asked questions, and never participated in the intellectual debates that other students found so stimulating. He would arrive early each morning, sit in the same spot at the back of the room, and listen with complete attention. But when called upon to share his understanding, he would simply bow and remain silent. The other students began to whisper among themselves. Perhaps Keisuke was too simple to grasp the complex teachings. Perhaps he was too proud to reveal his ignorance. Some even suggested he might be mute, though he was occasionally heard exchanging brief pleasantries with other students between classes. Master Takeshi found himself increasingly frustrated with this silent pupil. As a teacher, his greatest satisfaction came from seeing understanding dawn in his students' eyes, from witnessing their intellectual growth through spirited discussion and questioning. Keisuke's persistent silence felt like a rejection of everything the educational process was meant to accomplish. One day, after a particularly engaging lecture on the nature of wisdom, Master Takeshi decided to confront the situation directly. "Keisuke," he said, addressing the quiet student as the other pupils filed out of the classroom. "You have been attending my lectures for 6 months, yet you never speak. How can I know whether you understand the teachings if you don't demonstrate your comprehension through discussion?" Keisuke rose from his cushion and approached the teacher's desk with the same careful attention he brought to everything he did. "Honorable teacher," he said quietly, "may I ask you something?" Master Takeshi was surprised to hear the student's voice, which carried a quality of thoughtfulness he had not expected. "Of course. Please, ask whatever you wish. When you eat your morning rice, do you explain to each grain how delicious it tastes?" The master paused, puzzled by the seemingly unrelated question. "No, of course not. I simply eat and appreciate." "When you sleep at night, do you describe you feel?" "No. I to your pillow how comfortable it makes simply rest, and am grateful for the comfort. When you see the morning sun rise over the mountains, do you lecture it about its beauty?" "No. Master Takeshi began to sense where this conversation was leading. Keisuke bowed respectfully. Then why do you assume that understanding must always express itself through words? Can appreciation not exist in silence? Can wisdom not be received without being immediately repeated? The teacher felt something shift in his perception, like looking at a familiar landscape from an entirely new angle. But how can I guide your learning if I don't know what you understand? With respect, honorable teacher, you guide my learning every time you share your wisdom with genuine care. Whether I understand correctly or incorrectly, your intention to teach is complete in each moment you offer it. My understanding is my responsibility to cultivate. Over the following weeks, Master Takeshi began observing Keisuke more carefully. He noticed that the silent student's attention never wavered during lectures, even when other pupils seemed distracted. He observed that Keisuke often stayed after class to arrange the cushions and clean the classroom without being asked. He saw that other students would sometimes approach Keisuke privately for help with concepts they were struggling with. Most remarkably, Master Takeshi began to notice that Keisuke's presence in the classroom seemed to enhance the quality of attention of everyone around him. His deep listening created a kind of spaciousness that allowed the teachings to penetrate more deeply than usual. One morning, as Master Takeshi was preparing for his lecture, he found Keisuke in the classroom earlier than usual, sitting in meditation posture with his eyes closed. "Keisuke," the teacher said softly, not wanting to startle him, "the lecture doesn't begin for another hour." The student opened his eyes with a gentle smile. "I know, honored teacher. I come early to prepare my mind to receive whatever you offer today. If my mind is cluttered with my own thoughts and opinions, how can there be space for new understanding to enter?" Master Takeshi realized that he had been making a fundamental error in his assessment of this student. He had confused silence with emptiness, when in fact Keisuke's silence emerged from a fullness of attention that left no energy for unnecessary commentary. "May I ask you something?" the teacher said, settling onto a cushion beside his student. "Of course. Do you understand the teachings I share in class?" Keisuke considered the question carefully before answering. "Some teachings I understand immediately. Some I understand partially and continue to contemplate. Some I don't understand at all yet, but I hold them in my heart until clarity emerges. But I have learned that rushing to demonstrate understanding often prevents actual understanding from deepening." "What do you mean?" "When I hear something profound, my first impulse, might explain it to others, is to think about or how it relates to something I already know, or whether I agree with it. But all of that mental activity can prevent the teaching from settling into the deeper parts of my consciousness where real transformation happens." Master Takeshi felt a profound shift in his understanding of what teaching and learning actually involved. He had been so focused on Tiantian that he had missed external signs of comprehending the deeper process of integration that was happening in his silent student. From that day forward, his approach to teaching began to change. While he continued to encourage discussion and questioning, he also began to cultivate periods of silence in his classes, allowing students to simply absorb what they had heard without immediately analyzing or discussing it. He noticed that these moments of quiet reflection seemed to deepen the impact of his teachings in ways that constant verbal processing had not achieved. Students began reporting insights that emerged hours or days after lectures, understanding that had developed in the spaciousness of contemplative silence rather than in the heat of intellectual debate. Years later, when Master Takeshi was asked about the most important lesson he had learned as a teacher, he would tell the story of his silent student. "Keisuke taught me that the deepest learning happens not in the noise of discussion, but in the stillness of receptive attention, he would say. Sometimes the most profound response to wisdom is simply to receive it completely, like earth receiving rain. The Carpenter's Crooked House. Our 13th story takes us to a mountain village where the sound of hammers and saws created a steady rhythm of construction and repair. Among the craftsmen lived Jiro, a carpenter whose reputation for precision and attention to detail had made him the most sought-after builder in 3 neighboring valleys. Jiro approached his work with the intensity of a master calligrapher, measuring twice and cutting once, ensuring that every joint fit perfectly and every beam was aligned with mathematical accuracy. His houses were marvels of engineering and craftsmanship, built to last for generations with not a single wasted motion or unnecessary piece of wood. But Jiro's perfectionism had become a source of increasing anxiety as he aged. Each project took longer to complete as he obsessed over details that most people would never notice. His reputation for perfection had created expectations that felt impossible to maintain, and he lived in constant fear of making a mistake that would damage his standing in the community. The challenge that would transform his understanding came in the form of an unusual commission. A wealthy merchant who had heard of Jiro's skills hired him to build a house on a plot of land that presented extraordinary difficulties. The lot was on a steep hillside with rocky, uneven terrain and a large boulder that could not be moved positioned exactly where conventional design would place the main support beam. Any other carpenter would have recommended finding a different location, but Jiro's pride in his problem-solving abilities made him accept the seemingly impossible challenge. He spent weeks creating detailed plans that would work around the obstacles, designing a structure that would be both stable and beautiful despite the difficult conditions. Construction began well enough, but as the house took shape, Jiro realized that his careful plans had not accounted for every variable the challenging site presented. The natural slope of the land meant that achieving perfect level floors would require extensive and expensive grading. The boulder that he had planned to incorporate as a decorative element actually interfered with the structural integrity he was trying to achieve. Most frustrating of all, the irregularities of the terrain meant that no matter how precisely he measured and cut each piece, the overall structure had to accommodate the imperfections of its environment. For the first time in his career, Jiro found himself building a house that was intentionally not square, not level, and not symmetrical. His anxiety mounted with each compromise he was forced to make. This house would not showcase his usual precision and perfection. Instead, it would reveal his adaptation to circumstances beyond his control, and he feared that his reputation would suffer as a result. Midway through the construction, Jiro's elderly mentor, Master Yamamoto, came to visit the worksite. The old carpenter had taught Jiro decades earlier and had been following his career with pride and interest. "How is the work progressing?" Master Yamamoto asked, studying the unusual structure that was taking shape on the difficult hillside. "Terribly," Jiro replied with obvious frustration. "Nothing is going according to plan. The house is crooked, the floors aren't perfectly level, and the whole structure has to bend and flex with the landscape instead of imposing proper geometric order upon it." Master Yamamoto walked around the building slowly, examining the creative solutions Jiro had developed to work with the challenging terrain. His expression showed not disappointment, but growing fascination. "This is the most interesting house you've ever built," he said finally. Jiro looked at his mentor in confusion. "How can you say that? It violates every principle of proper construction." Nothing about it is perfect. Exactly, the old master replied with a smile. And that's what makes it perfect for this place. Look around you, Jiro. Do you see anything in this natural landscape that follows the geometric perfection you usually impose on your buildings? Jiro paused to really observe his surroundings for the first time since beginning the project. The trees grew at angles determined by their search for sunlight and their need to anchor themselves in rocky soil. The stream that ran nearby followed a winding path shaped by the natural contours of the land. Even the boulder that had caused him so much trouble sat at an angle that looked completely natural and appropriate in its setting. Nothing here is geometrically perfect, he admitted, and yet everything here is perfectly suited to its environment, Master Yamamoto observed. Your usual approach to building creates houses that could exist anywhere because they impose their own order regardless of their surroundings. But this house could only exist here, in this specific place, shaped by these particular conditions. But surely people expect precision and craftsmanship. They expect a house that serves their needs and feels like home, his mentor replied. This house will do something your previous perfect houses never could. It will feel like it grew naturally from this hillside rather than being imposed upon it. As construction continued, Jiro began to see his work differently. Instead of fighting against the irregularities of the site, he started collaborating with them. Where the floor couldn't be perfectly level, he created subtle terraces that followed the natural slope. Where walls couldn't be perfectly straight, he allowed them to curve gently with the contours of the land. The boulder that had seemed like such an obstacle became the centerpiece of the main room, its natural texture and form, creating a focal point that no manufactured element could have matched. When the house was finally completed, Jiro stepped back to survey his work with trepidation. By his old standards, the structure was deeply flawed. But as he looked at it in the context of its environment, he began to see something he had never achieved in his previous, perfect buildings. The house looked like it belonged. It seemed to have grown from the hillside rather than being placed upon it. The irregularities that had caused him such anxiety now appeared to be intentional design elements that created visual interest and natural harmony. When the merchant client saw the finished house, his reaction exceeded all expectations. Instead of criticizing the imperfections, he was delighted by the unique character of his new home. "This house has soul," he declared. "It doesn't feel like a generic structure that could be anywhere. It feels like it was meant to be exactly here, in this specific place." Word of the unusual house spread throughout the region, and Jiro found himself receiving commissions from clients who specifically wanted buildings that worked with their natural environment, rather than imposing geometric perfection upon it. His approach to carpentry was forever changed by the experience of building the crooked house. He continued to work with great skill and attention to detail, but he no longer demanded that every structure conform to abstract ideals of perfection that ignored the specific conditions where it would exist. Years later, when apprentice carpenters asked Jiro about the secret to creating buildings that felt truly at home in their surroundings, he would take them to visit the house on the hillside. "This house taught me the difference between perfection and appropriateness," he would explain. "Perfection tries to impose ideal forms on imperfect conditions. Appropriateness finds the ideal form that emerges from working skillfully with whatever conditions are actually present." The crooked house still stands on its challenging hillside, weathering beautifully as it settles even more naturally into its environment with each passing season. Visitors often remark that it looks like it has been there forever, as if the mountain itself had dreamed it into existence. The musicians, Broken String. Our 14th story unfolds in the imperial court, where the most accomplished artists of the realm would gather to perform for the emperor and his refined audience. Among these gifted musicians was Akira, a master of the seven-stringed koto whose performances were said to move listeners to tears with their exquisite beauty and technical perfection. Akira had devoted his entire life to mastering his instrument, practicing for countless hours each day until his fingers moved across the strings with supernatural precision. His reputation was built on flawless performances where not a single note was out of place, not a single rhythm imperfect. The emperor himself had declared Akira's playing to be the finest example of musical art in the kingdom. But this perfection had become a burden that weighed heavily on Akira's spirit. Each performance felt like walking across a tightrope where a single mistake would shatter his carefully maintained reputation. He lived in constant fear of the moment when his fingers might betray him, when age or nerves might cause the flaw that would end his career. The crisis came during the most important performance of his life, a special concert to celebrate the emperor's birthday. The entire court was present, along with visiting dignitaries from neighboring kingdoms. Akira had prepared for months, selecting pieces that would showcase both his technical mastery and his artistic sensitivity. As he began the evening's performance with a delicate piece about cherry blossoms in spring, disaster struck. One of the koto's 7 strings snapped with an audible pop that echoed through the silent hall. The broken string left him with only 6 strings to complete a repertoire that required all 7. Akira's first instinct was to stop the performance and request time to repair his instrument. But something prevented him from interrupting the flow of the evening. Perhaps it was professional pride, or perhaps it was a deeper intuition that this moment was teaching him something important. Instead of stopping, Akira continued playing, instantly adapting his technique to work with the 6 remaining strings. The piece he had planned to play was impossible in its original form, but his years of musical training allowed him to improvise variations that worked within his new limitations. As the performance continued, something remarkable began to happen. The music that emerged from his adaptation was unlike anything he had played before. The constraint of the missing string forced him to find new melodic pathways, to discover harmonies he had never explored, to create rhythmic patterns that would have been impossible with all 7 strings available. The audience, initially concerned when they heard the string break, found themselves drawn into music that felt more alive, more spontaneous, and more emotionally resonant than the technically perfect performances they usually heard from Akira. When the evening concluded, the emperor himself approached the musician with an expression of wonder. "Master Akira," the emperor said, "in all the years I have heard you play, I have never been so moved by your music. There was something in tonight's performance that touched my heart in a way that technical perfection never has. What was different?" Akira bowed deeply, uncertain how to explain what he himself was still trying to understand. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "tonight my koto had only 6 strings instead of 7. I was forced to play not the music I had planned, but the music that was possible with what remained. And yet it was the most beautiful music you have ever created in my presence. How do you explain this paradox?" Akira considered the question, still processing his own experience of the evening. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "when I could no longer rely on technical perfection, I had to rely on something deeper. When I couldn't play the notes I had planned, I had to listen more carefully to the notes that were actually available. The broken string forced me to discover music I didn't know existed." The emperor nodded thoughtfully. "So, limitation became liberation? In a way, yes. When I had all 7 strings, I played the music I knew. When I had only 6, I had to play the music that emerged from the present moment. In the days following this revelation, Akira began experimenting with his practice in ways that would have horrified him before the broken string incident. He would deliberately limit himself to 5 strings, or 4, or even 3, discovering what music was possible within each constraint. He found that these limitations forced him to develop aspects of his musicianship that unlimited technical resources had never required. With fewer strings available, he had to become more creative with rhythm, more innovative with melody, more expressive with dynamics. Most surprisingly, he discovered that audiences responded more enthusiastically to these constrained performances than they ever had to his previous technically perfect concerts. The music that emerged from working creatively with limitations seemed to speak to people's hearts in ways that flawless execution had not achieved. A young musician who had been studying with Akira asked him about this paradox. "Master," the student said, "I came to learn how to play perfectly, but now you teach me to work with imperfection. I don't understand how limitations can improve music." Akira smiled and gestured toward his koto, which he had deliberately restrung with only 5 strings for that day's lesson. "Perfect technique serves the music," he replied. "But when technique becomes the goal instead of the means, it can actually interfere with musical expression. When I had to work with broken strings, I couldn't rely on showing off my technical abilities. I had to focus entirely on creating beauty with whatever resources were available." But surely technical skill is important? Absolutely. But technical skill should be like a perfectly maintained garden path that allows you to walk easily toward your destination. If you become so fascinated with the perfection of the path that you stop walking, you never reach where you were trying to go. Years later, Akira became known not just for his technical mastery, but for his ability to create music that seemed to emerge spontaneously from each unique moment and circumstance. Students would travel from distant regions to learn his secret, and he would always begin their instruction the same way, by deliberately breaking one of their instrument's strings. Music, he would tell them, is not about having perfect resources. It's about making perfect use of whatever resources you actually have. The koto with the broken string still sits in Akira's studio, though he could easily afford to replace it with a perfect instrument. He keeps it as a reminder that some of life's most beautiful creations emerge not from ideal conditions, but from the creative response to unexpected limitations. The doctor's incurable patient. Our 15th story brings us to a medical clinic where Dr. Hayashi had built his reputation on an impressive record of successful treatments and satisfied patients. His knowledge of both traditional herbal medicine and newer techniques was encyclopedic, and his diagnostic abilities were considered nearly miraculous by those who had benefited from his care. Dr. Hayashi took deep pride in his ability to cure ailments that other physicians had declared hopeless. His clinic walls were covered with letters of gratitude from patients whose lives he had saved or significantly improved. He had come to see himself as someone who could fix almost any medical problem through the application of sufficient knowledge, skill, and determination. This self-image was shattered when Mrs. Tanaka came to his clinic carrying her 7-year-old grandson, Kenji. The boy suffered from a degenerative condition that was slowly but inexorably destroying his nervous system. Multiple specialists had confirmed that the disease was incurable and would eventually claim the child's life, probably within 2 years. Mrs. Tanaka had heard of Dr. Hayashi's reputation for achieving impossible cures and had traveled great distances to bring her grandson to him as a last resort. The desperation in her eyes and the trust she placed in his abilities created a pressure that Dr. Hayashi had never experienced before. After examining the child thoroughly and consulting every text and colleague he could access, Dr. Hayashi was forced to confirm what the other doctors had already told the family. The boy's condition was indeed incurable by any medical knowledge currently available. But instead of accepting this limitation, Dr. Hayashi became collect rare, traveled to distant mountains to obsessed with finding a cure. He spent sleepless nights researching obscure treatments herbs and consulted with elderly practitioners whose methods bordered on folk magic rather than medicine. As weeks turned into months, Dr. Hayashi's obsession began consuming his entire practice. He spent so much time and energy on this one impossible case that his other patients began receiving less attention than they deserved. His usually precise diagnostic abilities became clouded by his emotional attachment to achieving the impossible. Meanwhile, young Kenji's condition continued its inevitable progression. The experimental treatments Dr. Hayashi tried showed no effect on the underlying disease, though some caused uncomfortable side effects that added to the boy's suffering. One morning, Dr. Hayashi found Mrs. Tanaka sitting in his waiting room with tears streaming down her face. "Doctor," she said quietly, "I need to ask you to stop trying to cure my grandson." Dr. Hayashi felt as though he had been physically struck. "But I haven't exhausted all possibilities yet. There are still treatments we haven't tried, specialists we haven't consulted." "I know you mean well," Mrs. Tanaka replied gently, "but your attempts to cure him are preventing both of us from accepting what we need to accept. Kenji is going to die from this disease. Instead of spending his remaining time in hope for miracles that may not come, I want to spend it helping him live as fully as possible with the time he has." Dr. Hayashi felt his entire professional identity crumbling. If he couldn't cure this child, what was the purpose of all his knowledge and skill? What did it mean to be a healer if healing was sometimes impossible? That evening, he sought counsel from his own teacher, an elderly doctor who had mentored him decades earlier. The old physician listened to Dr. Hayashi's anguish with the patience that comes from having faced similar struggles. "My son," the elder said finally, "tell me what you believe your role as a physician should be." "To cure disease," Dr. Hayashi replied without hesitation. "To restore health, to save lives, to fix what is broken in the human body." "And when cure is impossible?" Dr. Hayashi paused, realizing he had never seriously considered this question despite years of medical practice. I suppose I have always assumed that cure was possible if I just worked hard enough, knew enough, tried enough different approaches." The old teacher smiled with gentle understanding. "That assumption has served you well in many cases, but it has also blinded you to other ways of serving your patients. Tell me, in all your efforts to cure young Kenji, have you helped him in any other ways?" Dr. Hayashi reflected on his interactions with the boy and his grandmother. "I've given them hope, I suppose. I've shown them that someone cares enough to try everything possible. Both valuable gifts. But what might you offer them if you accepted that cure is not possible?" The question opened a door in Dr. Hayashi's mind that he had never noticed before. What if his role as a healer extended beyond curing to include other forms of care? When Mrs. Tanaka brought Kenji for what she had decided would be their final visit, Dr. Hayashi approached them with a completely different energy. "I understand you want me to stop trying to cure Kenji," he said gently. "But would you allow me to help in other ways?" Instead of focusing on treatments that might extend the boy's life, Dr. Hayashi began focusing on interventions that would improve the quality of whatever time remained. He prescribed medicines that would reduce pain and discomfort. He suggested activities that would bring joy despite physical limitations. He even helped the family plan special experiences that would create precious memories. Most importantly, he offered himself as someone who could witness their journey without trying to change its destination. He became a source of comfort and support, rather than a desperate searcher for impossible solutions. As Kenji's condition worsened over the following months, Dr. Hayashi discovered a form of medical practice he had never learned in school. He learned to sit with suffering without trying to eliminate it. He learned to offer presence as a form of treatment. He learned that sometimes the most healing thing a doctor can do is acknowledge the limits of medicine while affirming the unlimited capacity for human compassion. When Kenji finally died, surrounded by family who had been able to prepare for his departure rather than fighting against it, Mrs. Tanaka thanked Dr. Hayashi in a way that surprised him. "You gave us something more valuable than a cure," she said. "You gave us permission to love him completely without the distraction of false hope. Because we weren't focused on changing what couldn't be changed, we were able to appreciate what was actually present." This experience transformed Dr. Hayashi's entire approach to medicine. He continued to pursue cures with skill and determination when cure was possible. But he also developed a deeper understanding of healing that extended beyond the elimination of disease. He began spending more time with patients who were facing terminal illnesses, offering not false hope, but genuine companionship on their difficult journeys. He learned to distinguish between the hope for specific outcomes and the hope that comes from knowing one is not alone in facing whatever comes. His reputation evolved from being the doctor who could cure anything to being the doctor who could help with everything. Patients sought him out not just for his medical expertise, but for his ability to provide comfort and guidance when medical solutions were insufficient. Years later, when medical students asked Dr. Hayashi about the most important lesson of his career, he would tell them about the boy he couldn't cure. "Kenji taught me that healing and curing are not the same thing," he would explain. "Curing is what we do to diseases. Healing is what we offer to people. Sometimes cure is possible, and we should pursue it with everything we have, but healing is always possible, even when cure is not." The photograph of young Kenji still sits on Dr. Hayashi's desk, not as a reminder of failure, but as a symbol of the deeper understanding of medicine that emerges when we learn to work skillfully with both the possible and the impossible. The Merchant's Empty Scales. Our 16th story takes us to a bustling marketplace where the honest merchant Nobuo had built his reputation on fair dealing and accurate measurements. His scales were perfectly calibrated, his weights precisely maintained, and his prices consistently reasonable. Customers trusted him completely, knowing they would receive exactly what they paid for without fear of being cheated. But Nobuo's obsession with precise measurement had gradually extended beyond his business practices into every aspect of his life. He measured his success by comparing his profits to those of other merchants. He measured his happiness by calculating whether he had received equal value in every relationship and transaction. He even measured his spiritual progress by keeping detailed records of his meditation sessions and charitable donations. This constant measuring and comparing had transformed Nobuo from a naturally generous man into someone who lived in perpetual calculation. Every kindness he offered came with mental bookkeeping about what he should receive in return. Every favor he accepted created a debt that weighed on his conscience until it was precisely repaid. The transformation in his character became clear during the annual festival, when merchants traditionally donated food and supplies for the community celebration. Nobuo carefully calculated exactly what percentage of his profits other merchants were contributing and donated precisely the same proportion, not a coin more or less. When his contribution was announced publicly, he felt satisfied that he had met his social obligations without exceeding them. But as he watched other merchants making their donations, he noticed something that disturbed him. Those who gave spontaneously, without careful calculation, seemed to experience a joy in their giving that his measured approach had never provided. The crisis that would change his understanding came when a fire destroyed the home of his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Ito. The woman had lost everything she owned and had no family to help her rebuild. The community rallied to support her, with neighbors contributing whatever they could spare. Nobuo's first instinct was to calculate an appropriate donation based on his relationship with Mrs. Ito, the value of goods lost, and what others were contributing. But as he sat at his desk with his ledgers and scales, trying to determine the precise amount that would be neither insufficient nor excessive, he realized something that filled him with shame. While he had been calculating, Mrs. Ida was sleeping in the temple because she had nowhere else to go. While he had been measuring the appropriate response, she was wearing borrowed clothes because everything she owned had been destroyed. His precision had become procrastination. His fairness had become selfishness. That evening, instead of making his carefully calculated donation, Nobuo did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He closed his shop early, gathered every blanket, piece of clothing, and household item he could spare, and took them directly to Mrs. Ito. "These are for you," he said simply, making no mention of repayment or reciprocal obligation. "Use whatever helps and give away whatever doesn't." Mrs. Ito looked at him with tears in her eyes. "But this is far too much. I could never repay such generosity." "There is nothing to repay," Nobuo replied, and as he spoke the words, he felt a lightness in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. This is simply what neighbors do for each other. As he walked home from Mrs. Ito's temporary shelter, Nobuo realized that the joy he felt from his spontaneous generosity was completely different from the satisfaction he usually derived from perfectly balanced transactions. This joy didn't depend on receiving equivalent value in return. It arose from the simple act of giving without measurement or expectation. Over the following weeks, Nobuo began experimenting with unmeasured generosity in small ways. He would add extra goods to customers' orders without charging for them. He would offer help to other merchants without calculating what favors he might receive in return. He began giving his time and attention freely, without keeping mental accounts of who owed him what. The response from his community was remarkable. Instead of taking advantage of his generosity, people began reciprocating in ways he had never experienced during his years of careful measurement. Customers became more loyal, other merchants began offering him better deals, and his reputation shifted from being known as fair to being known as kind. Most surprisingly, his business became more profitable, not less. The goodwill generated by his unmeasured generosity created relationships that were far more valuable than the small margins he had previously calculated so carefully. One morning, a young merchant who was just starting his own business came to Nobuo seeking advice. "Master Nobuo," the young man said, "everyone speaks of your fairness and generosity. What is the secret to conducting business with such integrity while still maintaining profitability?" Nobuo smiled and gestured toward the scales that still sat prominently on his counter, though he now used them differently than before. These scales taught me something important, he said. When I used them to measure everything precisely, ensuring perfect balance in every transaction, I created a business based on exact exchange. But exact exchange creates no surplus of goodwill, no extra warmth, no reason for people to prefer dealing with me rather than with any other honest merchant. So you don't use accurate measurements anymore? I use them for what they're meant for, Nobuo replied, ensuring that customers receive what they pay for. But I've learned that the most valuable things in business and life cannot be measured on scales. Trust, kindness, loyalty, joy. These arise only when we give more than we measure and receive more than we calculate. The young merchant looked puzzled. But how do you ensure fairness without precise measurement? As our journey through these 25 sacred stories draws to a close, feel the profound stillness that has settled into your being. These ancient teachings have worked their gentle magic, dissolving the tensions you carried and replacing them with a peace that needs no reason, no explanation, no effort to maintain. Let this tranquility be your companion as you drift into restorative sleep, knowing that wisdom has taken root in the fertile silence of your heart, ready to bloom in tomorrow's light.